The wave of looters that was kicked into high gear in 2009 when Borderlands released has only gained more momentum in the years that followed, forming a fairly competitive market. These new games took looting away from traditional RPG and top-down styles of the late 90s and instead brought shooting and other action-oriented gameplay into the mix. Having played most of the games that followed, putting more hours than I care to admit into some and at minimum trying others, I noticed a disappointing trend take hold. Despite this new craze taking advantage of more active genres, a lot of these games seem to throw up arbitrary restrictions. The games were filled with bullet sponge enemies, put restrictions on player skill usage with unnecessary cooldowns on tightly balanced abilities. Players would find themselves fighting for stat scraps and minor bonuses through daily and weekly grinds in repeated locations, like they were playing an MMO, in some cases with the same massive worlds to match. Not a huge fan of that. Taking deliberately tuned parts of one genre and using it to hold back another isn't typically a recipe for success, especially when your antics are outdone by games that came out 20 years before yours. But maybe that's just me. After all, games in this subgenre are still being made despite most of them struggling with the same issues, so I guess these games are making some kind of profit. Now, why did I just ramble about all that? Because the latest loot-driven game by developer People Can Fly, Outriders, surprised me. Not by having the magic fix-all for these issues, but by handling its gameplay design in such a way that I enjoyed it enough to mostly not notice. Outriders takes us to the world of Enoch, a potential new home to humanity after a handful of political talking points devastated Earth years prior, forcing evacuation. We play as one of the elite Outriders, on the first away team scoping out the promising environment, only to find malicious wildlife and toxic fauna in the ecosystem, capped off by a massive energy storm that fries electronic devices and has an assortment of negative effects on everyone present. After the initial landing, you are injured during a fight that breaks out and put into cryosleep. The story, should you choose to follow it from there, takes place 31 years later, awakening to find that things have turned dire. The initially united remainder of humanity has split into factions, plans have fallen apart, resources are depleting, and there is no clear path to taming this new planet, which is much more deadly than initially believed to be. Most of the story hits familiar tropes, although it has a few small hooks of its own. It will take you across the planet, hitting all the familiar regions of plains, forests, jungles, snowy mountains, volcanoes, deserts. It's all here, as well as some other unique and uncommon locations. You'll learn about the dangers presented there and potential solutions to the various problems as you build up your own crew and make your way from objective to objective. There's plenty of background lore to discover and side quests to partake in if the story wins you over more than it did me, and if you manage to follow it in between jumping into the sessions of other players. I personally think it begins to lose focus as you leave the second hub area, with a story that lacks focus and characters that lack range, being little more than background noise for most of the game, and it just barely reins itself in as you near the somewhat messy conclusion. But before all that, we receive a new batch of near-fatal injuries, only this time you are saved by the same deadly storms from earlier, and this is where you choose your class. Outriders has 4 classes to choose from. While each do damage, they also have a slight lean to specific roles that give them some distinction. There's the Devastator, essentially the tank. They can hold ground gain, soaking up the most damage of the 4, and do focused damage to single targets. The Pyromancer, a straightforward mid-range damage class with some self-healing capabilities to keep themselves in the fight. The Trickster, a hit-and-run close-range class with a handful of debuff, interrupt, and movement abilities at their disposal. And lastly, the Technomancer, which is all about long-range damage, crowd control, and support, with skills that deploy ordnance and other gadgets to keep the pressure on enemies. There are smaller nuances to each, like melee effects and how their passive healing works, but the real focus is the selection of skills that determine what specialties you bring to the fight, and the skill tree, filled with plenty of stat boosts and bonuses. Both are used to round out the class to fit individual player styles, and you can swap out skills and reset the skill tree at any time, meaning you don't have to worry about locking yourself into a branch that doesn't work for you, as you play around with different combinations and learn about a handful of status effects. Classes, skill trees, and abilities and what they do aside, Outriders is a cover-based third-person shooter up front. How you build your character doesn't matter much if the game's central mechanics don't hold it all together, and the gunplay is mostly fine. You handle 2 main weapons and a sidearm at all times. Each one you cycle through will have different base stats, variants, and modification capabilities, which you can change yourself as you progress and learn more about the modding system. And while most of the weapons lack weight and variety leaves a bit to be desired, they were effective overall. Unfortunately, I can't say the same about the cover system. The system is handled with 2 buttons, one for free movement dodging and the other for taking and moving between cover. But there is some overlap which can cause issues, and interacting with cover the wrong way can lock you into animations that leave you vulnerable. As you make your way deeper into the story and high difficulty tiers, the whole system falls apart. Late game encounters are mostly filled with mobs of aggressive enemies which break your cover, monster type enemies that disregard your cover, and elite enemies that are always marching towards you while using attacks that go through your cover or make fighting back impossible if you try to use cover. Basically, the cover system as is has very limited uses, especially if you are playing by yourself, being the sole focus of your enemies. Whether you try using cover or not, your choice of tools and how you use them will shape how you handle the challenges Outriders has to offer. Despite the variety in loot and abilities, encounters are very straightforward, each one boiling down to wiping out all the forces in your way. Aside from the occasional unique boss, the enemies you fight are made up of viciously aggressive close-range attackers that will close the gap quickly and typically fight with melee weapons, long-range snipers that bunker down and make up for their easily telegraphed attacks with deadly accuracy, standard infantry that will steadily make their way towards you depending on your location and threat level, and elite enemies that specialize in heavy attacks, taking high amounts of damage, using unique skills, or a mix of all three. There are also monster type enemies, and while they have some distinction between them, they boil down to two types of attacks: more aggressive melee, or long-range mortar-like projectiles, with the second type occasionally flying. Despite the lack of enemy variety, the core gameplay and the surprising number of unique locations kept things entertaining as I juggled an ever-changing list of equipment and modifications, adapting myself and my movement in a varied assortment of levels, pushing back against the constantly changing but easily understandable enemy formations. And when you rise to meet the aggressive pace the game sets, you find the most satisfying parts of it, taking advantage of where the gameplay meets your quickly growing assortment of tools. During my time as a technomancer, I was able to maintain a safe distance during fights, softening up enemies from afar while using ordnance to disrupt their cover. And at other times, I was setting my own lines of attrition, with skills and weapons that held the line with strong crowd control as I effectively pushed forward. The rate you unlock different mods, weapons, and skills as you make your way to the level cap had me experimenting in more ways than I was expecting, and when I did, I found new, fun, and effective ways to play. Even single weapons and mods can make a difference. One of my favorites made enemies I had shot freeze whenever I reloaded. With this, I could keep enemies in vulnerable positions, keep elite enemies locked down while clearing out mobs in between me and them, and in a pinch, I could burst fire into whole groups that were getting too close, letting me escape. If all of that didn't sound appealing, there are plenty of passive mod options that focus on making you more effective and deadly without worrying about triggering specific effects. Either way, if you've kitted out your character with the right equipment and mods, or at least ones that cater to your playstyle, you'll have more options, being able to determine when to engage which enemies and from what position. With laying into tanky enemies while taking fire from all sides being just as valid an option as picking off weaker enemies at a distance. If you are aggressive and have a plan, you'll be able to effectively keep up with these enemies in what can feel like a tug of war over your health. Sometimes. There are more than a few points where the game hits a wall as you approach and when you finally hit the end game. Occasionally you'll encounter elite enemies that massively raise the difficulty, seemingly at random, being thrown in with mobs that don't really match up. When this happens, you'll be left backpedaling out of combat zones while trying to whittle down enemy forces nipping at your heels. At the same time, ranged attackers throw whatever they have at you. If this weren't bad enough, there is another major issue the game has. While most of Outriders is straightforward, some enemy abilities stomp all over the game's balancing. You'll see lunging attacks that will change course midair to make sure they hit you, projectiles that home in on you when it looks like they shouldn't, long-range beams that can be stopped by walls but will sometimes clip through them anyway, lingering damage over time effects that have a minimal graphical presence, and massive area of effect attacks that start up and activate before you have an opportunity to see them coming, with you normally being at the epicenter. These are inverse reactions to the freer gameplay balancing that has worked in the game's favor so far, and unfortunately attacks that have tight avoidance requirements, a small interrupt window, and a steadily growing resistance to ability effects typically don't work all that well because higher world tier levels that increase the overall difficulty and endgame challenge tiers set you up to be a glass cannon. So even when you manage to find a way to tackle the game's content effectively, death can come quickly, and you normally won't see it coming with the lackluster UI and lack of distinct visuals for incoming attacks. I guess the important bit I found in all this is that the fun in Outriders is front-loaded. It's not a slog to the top followed by a drip feed of occasional excitement. It's the first game of its type where I felt like I was growing into my classes and discovering what builds worked for me as I leveled up in a well-paced manner. Something even most MMOs struggle with. And while I question its value as a single-player experience, especially with online connectivity requirements, what Outriders tried puts it above and beyond the competition when it comes to campaign and solo play. Unfortunately, if you intend to push beyond the campaign, and it's likely you would given the subgenre, playing alone can end up being a tedious challenge that doesn't quite seem worth the effort, and playing as a group doesn't help that much either, especially when the endgame content falls into the same trap that many of these games do, with repeating a similar set of challenges in a grind for resources and higher difficulty. And unfortunately, it lacks the satisfactory design of older games, and as of right now, there are no plans for additional content drops. The issues I do have with the game are not exclusive to it, and are common in the direction the shooter branch of looting-focused RPGs have gone. But most of them are alleviated by the way the game is balanced, and hopefully in the future it will remain that way. I'm sure there are some people that will rush to find the highest damage possible or look for purely optimal builds, but honestly, it's not quite necessary to shred enemies just a bit quicker when there are more fun and satisfying ways to play. Hopefully, with whatever the future holds for the game, People Can Fly won't attempt any harsh balancing practices or attempt to cater to some kind of niche min-max crowd, and will instead give us more variety in content and build upon the very flexible system we have. Lastly, with a release like Outriders, it's important to have a distinction between things being broken and things being unpolished. This here, the crashes, these disconnects, not being able to sign in, this is broken, and according to People Can Fly and what I can tell, these things will be fixed. Every other issue, including the smaller ones I didn't get to, things like the awkward pacing, animation issues, general ineffectiveness of cover, the lack of late game variety, the odd placement of barriers and loading screens, the map that lacks meaningful description, and seemingly missing aggro mechanic, these are a matter of polish and design, and are less likely to be fixed unless deliberate steps are taken. And the game will need these things looked at if it hopes to have staying power in the future with new and old releases. Or even if they just want to fix the core experience they have and rely on that being the legacy it leaves behind. Outriders doesn't seem to take itself seriously in any aspect, and honestly, it works in the game's favor. There's no strict high-level balancing, so you can focus on skills that cater to how you are playing, instead of trying to squeeze efficiency from each choice you make. The story is present, but not overbearing, giving the relaxed performances and campy story some breathing room. The gameplay is average, but the satisfying skills carry you through a game that has otherwise forgotten one of its core functions. It's rough around the edges, and nothing to write home about. Just a half-decent shooter with fun skills. But in a sea of loot-driven games that have harsher grinds and messier launches, maybe that's all you need. Oh, and the music sucks.